All right, so I just wanted to make a quick video. Got a machine in from a customer, and basically they had put it together and had some issues, which is actually something that we see pretty frequently. I thought it might be helpful to make a little video of my observations of things that we've encountered either in machines that we've had brought in from customers that have had issues that turned out to be assembly issues, or things that we've just seen in the course of fixing these machines. So anyway, I'll just get right into it. So first one, the spool holder is not a handle. It should not be used as such. It is not, strong enough to really to hold the machine reliably. I have seen people, bring their machines to me, holding them by this, and the first thing I tell them is, be careful, hold that thing by the frame. Really, the only safe place to grab this thing is here, so keep that in mind. On the y-axis, you're going to want to make sure that you don't tighten the front nuts retaining the smooth rods. Don't give them a final tighten until you pull the axis all the way forward and all the way back to make sure that that's in place. The little block at the front here on the y-axis should not be flush against the frame. The 10 mil bolts just need to interface with the nylocks, and the nylocks do need to be fully pulled into the surface of that part. You can fasten the screw to bottom out the nylock, then back it out, then affix it to the frame to make sure that you get proper interface. But that clearance is used to allow you to tension the belt in the future, making sure that the belt is tensioned before you put it on. They do want you to have them pretty tight. The bearings themselves, if you pay attention to the manual, they've got 4 sets of balls kind of set at 90-degree angles, and they do want you to install those with the bearing races riding on top of the smooth rods, so that's kind of important. You do want to pay attention to that. And they also want you to make sure that the bearings are centered in the slots that they have there. The tightening is also somewhat critical. You just don't want to deform the bearing because that could reduce the lifetime. On the x-axis, I've seen some weird business with the belt getting pinched. You do want to make sure you trim that. There is some accommodation for tensioning the belt with the rotation of the X motor after the install. Your belt should be pretty tight before that, and before you trim it, and you do want to make sure it's trimmed. There's some witness holes on the top and the bottom on the newest design of the X-carriage, so you can verify that your rods are fully pushed in there. There is a square nut that goes in the back of the X motor to with this 18 mil M3 nut, M3 bolt to retain the motor rotation before your final tighten. Don't forget to put that in, and when you do put it in, make sure it's inserted all the way. I've seen people forget one or the other, or try and tighten the screw with the nut halfway backed out. It needs to be aligned with the hole properly. You can check that with the smallest Allen wrench. In the case of this build, the customer had broken the the X idler side by over tightening, and it's not critical that this is super tightened down. You just want to make sure that the 18 mil bolt is interfaced with the nylock. Once it's locked in, that's as tight as it needs to be. You can use a pair of pliers to press the nylock into this side, using this side to press against rather than depressing that. But reprinted that was no problem. You can wait to tighten these until you're just finished, to make sure that the alignment is correct and those are tight. You also want to make sure you don't forget to install the hex nut on the inside of this guy. I have seen people forget to do that. That is important to maintain because the trap nut really does support the X carriage, and if you forget one of those, there's a chance that your carriage could actually deflect a little bit. So on the E axis, kind of quite a few things in there. So you can use just a small length of filament once things are kind of mostly put together to align the gears before you do the final tighten against the flat of the motor side. That's the way I like to do it. The shaft of the gear needs to be properly fit between the gears, or between the ears of the idler door. I've seen people only have one side, and it allows the side without the grub screw to, deflect when the filament's actually in there, which is counterproductive. When you're putting this thing together, you really want to make sure you really follow the instructions and don't pinch any wires. I've seen quite a few people with either broken X-carriage bits or pinched wires, various things going on there. If you follow the instructions correctly, that shouldn't happen. You do want to make sure that the nylon filament used to support the X-carriage harness, the E basically harness, is properly inserted into the electronics enclosure, as well as the back of the carriage there. I believe I've got a printed one of these. The hole that it fits into is that hole there, and you do want to make sure that that is properly secured, so that your cables are properly supported. Otherwise they can drag, and also, even worse than that, because dragging really isn't that big of a deal. It's really just about abrasion on this cable, which is why they switched to the textile sleeve. It really reduces the abrasion on these cables, which is going to be good for the longevity of this machine. I've seen people use the wrong lengths of screws. The documentation is very clear about what lengths of screws to use where. Each bag from the build has the length of screw on it, so you can't get them. So and each step of the install has the. There you go. Yeah, each bag has the lengths of screw on it, so you really just want to double check all your screw lengths against that, and don't. If you sense resistance, it's probably best to double check that you're doing something right before you screw something up. The idler screws, I've seen quite a few people really mash these things in. They do not need to be very tight. Basically, if they're flush, that's about as tight as you want them. If they're anything past that, and when I say flush, flush on either side. If the heads are past the surface, bottoming out, that's no good. If you've got the thread sticking out of the other side, that's also no good. You just want to make sure they're just holding that thing, nice and tight there. Don't plug in the pin to backwards. It will go in backwards. I've seen people do that. Just be careful about that. Also, mind the wires, that they don't interfere with the top of the frame. They do tell you to sort of bend them in a particular orientation. That's important to take note of. All the zip ties, you do want to make sure you insert those with the correct orientation, both when you're tightening them and when you're inserting them. Where the heads end up is also, not critical, but is important, especially as far as where the zip ties are on the back of the extruder. There could be interference with the frame if you don't secure those in the correct orientation, with the heads basically oriented to the top, and then on the actual heater and thermistor wires, those should be secured on the bottom. On the LCD, I've seen quite a few people with loosey-goosey LCD frames. The bottom two screws that secure the LCD on should be secured until they bottom out. Those are self-tapping, so it can be, just go slow and, make sure it's not rattling, and you'll be good. LCD cables are keyed opposite on both ends. So the way I like to do it is I like to have the cables kind of coming up and out, with the number 1 cable on the top, number 2 on the bottom, routed on the inside of the frame, and then basically up and underneath like so. You can see them coming out, going over, and then up into the electronics box, all bundled there. And then when they actually go into the enclosure, they can kind of go up and around. I'll try and include a picture of that. The new style electronics box, there are some captive nuts that go on the top. You do want to make sure you put those so that the retainer can properly clamp against the textile sleeve, and so you really avoid any kind of movement, which can cause abrasion, which can cause premature failure of everything connected to this harness, including both fans, the pin to probe, the hot end, the thermistor, all kinds of things. So you really want to make sure that the integrity of that cable is correct, or you may experience premature failure of your machine. It's, so I've seen people not get these captive nuts in for the Rambo. That's important. So do that. The new design is a little bit more tricky for the one, but if you just kind of hold it up and at an angle, you can get it maneuvered in there. It's not that big of a deal. The pre-flight, where you ensure the alignment or basically the offset of the nozzle to the probe is correct. That's super critical, and that's also the reason why they have you put the piece of paper under when you're doing the test. If the pin is not hooked up, well, I'm sorry. If your nozzle is much lower than your probe beyond the sensing distance of the probe, which is calibrated in that pre-flight step, because the sensing distance is about 2 mil, and you want the nozzle to be within that range. If your probe is too low, then your nozzle won't be able to print, and your probe would just be knocking into the part. If it's too high, that's the purpose of the piece of paper. The thing it's searching for is the bed, and if the nozzle is below the sensing distance of the probe, then it will run into the paper. That's when you're supposed to reset, and then you consult the manual or consult support, and then they make sure that you ran the pre-flight, and you're kind of good to go. But really, yeah, the most common failure situations we see on this thing are pretty much extruder harness not being secured correctly, causing cable abrasion, and people breaking parts from using the wrong size of screws, or missing steps, essentially. Nothing I'm talking about isn't documented in the manual, but it's a complex build, and as you're going through it, you might have a tendency to sort of skip something over or neglect steps. But if you get stuck, Prusa's there to help, and so are we. If you're on the West Coast, I hope you hit us up, and hopefully we can take care of you. But anyway, I hope this helps, and yeah, we aren't Prusa. We're not affiliated with them. I'd love to be a wholesaler, but I'm not. If you break parts that's not covered by warranty, it's considered an assembly issue, and they will expect you to pay for replacements and shipping. So, be careful when you're putting it together. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much all I got. I had a bunch of other stuff I was going to say, but it's not really critical to the main point of the thing, which is making sure that you kind of get your machine put together correctly and have a good time printing. That's really it. So, hey, thanks for watching. Good times.